Welcome back to the Digital Studio. In this session, we're going to be talking about the PRI's Progression Pathways, which is a new initiative to guide investors step by step on their responsible journey. And as for all our previous sessions, you can submit your questions on Slido on the right-hand side of your screen. Just make sure to select Live Studio when you do it. And so I'm delighted to welcome our guest for this session. We have Kate Webber, PRI's newly appointed Chief Responsible Investment Solutions Officer. And we also have Nathan Fabian, PRI's Chief Sustainable Systems Officer. So thank you so much for joining us in this session to talk about this really exciting new initiative. So the first question is, we had a breakout session this morning chaired by Michael Yancey on the future of investor reporting, in which it was mentioned how disclosure or reporting requirements for investors have been rapidly evolving. Just a note to our audience, this wasn't live streamed on this channel, but you can watch it on Catch Up. So Kate, I was wondering if you could give us a brief take on the changes signatories are facing and the impact this is having on them.
Thank you. So there's a number of themes that are coming through. So one of them was when we first started reporting many years ago. There wasn't that much regulatory reporting in the ESG area. Now that's completely different. Across the world, we're seeing a lot more regulatory reporting and a lot more scrutiny than there was before. And we're also, within the context of the overall scrutiny and the greater level of regulatory reporting, we're also seeing a lot more data points that people are pulling through. So there's a lot more effort and complexity in providing the data both to us and to a number of other places. And that's both complexity in terms of the number of data points, but also the number of regions that people are having to report that data into. And that fragmentation of regulation, particularly around reporting, increases the complexity that a number of our signatories are finding in terms of how they report. And so that we're starting to see that level of overlap. And going forward, what we want to do is be able to find a way of supporting our signatories to continue to report, but in a simplified way.
Absolutely, and reporting and the amount of reporting required in this area has been a discussion point already here in the studio. The PRI is somewhat renowned for reporting. It's not uncommon to hear people complain about the size of the reporting ask. How is the PRI responding to that part, to be part of the solution to this rather than part of the problem? Oh, sorry, that's to Nathan.
Thanks, Emily. Well, we've got to remember where reporting came from. It was introduced as a way for signatories to demonstrate that they were implementing the 6 principles, which of course is their commitment as a signatory. And so this regime has been in for a long time, many years, but of course we've found that it has grown as ESG integration, responsible investing has become widely practiced, and with many different types of investors, we simply added to reporting year by year. And so we're certainly renowned for reporting because our reporting instrument has become very large and challenging. And of course the idea was to include some challenge for investors so that there were things to learn and things to demonstrate and show some difference in practice in the community. But over time, after years of this approach, it just becomes unmanageable. And so we'd like to be renowned for something a bit different, I think, in future. And our aim is that we maintain this idea of accountability to the 6 principles, but in the environment that Kate's describing, this is a much more modest idea. When regulators with real accountability mandates are stepping into the market, our role is just to ensure that a signatory is doing something substantial that is relevant to them, to their clients, or to their beneficiaries and stakeholders, and that they can demonstrate that to us. So in our future, foundational reporting for us, and the name describes it, should indicate a base of execution on the 6 principles. It should be easier to complete than it is to deal with our current reporting and assessment framework, and we hope that it will fit in this new world where there are so many now mandatory requirements from governments and financial authorities.
So can you give us some examples then of how you're going to make this reporting easier?
Well, it's still under design, I've got to say, but we're working hard on it. The idea that we're trying to, or the principles, if you like, we're trying to use in designing this are that accountability to the 6 principles should be more flexible, than we are now. So rather than having to demonstrate some action in every conceivable type of responsible investment practice, you should just be able to provide some evidence of the activities that are relevant for you. So this idea of what should be disclosed is much more modest, I think, than the one-size-fits-all but all activities approach. And I guess the thing that's interesting about progression pathways is that it allows us to distinguish between meeting accountability, which is a fairly de minimis or modest concept, with the idea of progression, which is much more ambitious. It goes to being sophisticated. It goes to investing and investors differentiating themselves from each other. And that's a different idea than accountability to the PRI. So we're trying to separate this idea of foundational reporting and progression reporting, which is much more about supporting learning and advancement. And that big difference will make the future reporting feel very different for signatories.
So what can you tell me then about the different pathways?
So we envisage 3 pathways, and it's important to say that this process of developing the pathways is almost 18 months old already. We've engaged well over 1,000 of our signatories in an individual feedback opportunities through workshops and questionnaires, and we've come to the point of thinking there are 3 pathways, and the audience will have to excuse us for the not very sophisticated naming, but we have pathway A, B and C. The pathways, we're naming them that way because really it's the substance of what's happening in each pathway that's important. So the idea of a pathway A is most closely related to addressing ESG risk and incorporating ESG information to be a good risk-return investor. This is an idea that our signatories know, and in truth, all signatories do this to some extent. It's just that some have this as their primary objective, their primary purpose as a responsible investor, and this is what Pathway A is meant to serve. Pathway B is for investors who have a slightly longer term horizon or a longer term obligation to a beneficiary or a client, and they can start to see through some of the shorter term risk return pricing signals in markets, and they can think about what is going to drive their financial returns in the long term. And of course, when we're talking about this type of time frame, sustainability factors start to play a really material role. Climate transition, nature, inequality in societies, these become market relevant factors. And so Pathway B is for the investors who are trying to drive these factors in a way that support their portfolio returns and their obligations to their investors. So that's what Pathway B is for. Pathway C is for the investors who are trying to have some actual demonstrable impact on sustainability factors. And in a way, this can be a fairly short-term concept as well. The impact investors out there will know that you need to have some additional and evidential impact or contribution to a sustainability outcome. And so that might mean, for example, your investment leading to more hospital beds, or leading to an increase in wage for workers, or actually taking pollution out of an ecosystem. These are very direct and, as I say, can be demonstrated. So this is what Pathway C is for the investors trying to demonstrate impact while they're pursuing their financial objectives, whatever those might be. Now, in aggregate, we think this covers the spectrum of what most signatories sign up to when they become a signatory. I mean, it's possible to have pathways between the pathways, but our objective is to keep it simple and comparable so that everyone can find a pathway for them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for explaining that. So, Kate, coming back to you, this is obviously a complex area.
Yes.
As we've heard, there's a wide range of views on possible solutions. So how has the PRI assured itself that this change to progression pathways is actually the right way forward?
Thank you. It's a really good question. So we started thinking about this last year, and that it came on the back of the PRI in the Changing World consultation, which was in 2023. And what we did is we started a co-design process with a good number of very active signatories. And through that co-design process, we've held a number of workshops, and we've held a number of workshops on key points of interest and then on wider activity. And we've used those co-design workshops to really drive down towards the things that really matter across the signatory group. The signatory group has grown exponentially in the last few years. And as a result, some of the some of the needs are much more diverse than they were when it started. And as a result, the pathways are designed to support all of the signatories, whatever they feel responsible investing is going to be. And the concept is that through responsible investment, through the pathways, we'll be able to deliver their version of responsible investment to them as point plans. So if they want to talk about particular topics, we will drive content to them in a way that makes it easy for them to work through how to be a more responsible investor, and use the reporting to back that up rather than drive it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Just a reminder to our audience, you can submit questions to us live through Slido on the right-hand side of your screen. Just make sure to select Live Studio when you do it. So an inevitable question really, because this all sounds fantastic, is when can people actually see and use the progression pathways? Who wants to take that?
Well, I'm happy to go, be the one who's doing the commitments. Kate's the one who's going to make sure we deliver it. No, we're doing that together, of course. So our aim is that in 2025, and we're not specifying a date, but as early as possible, we will release a pilot framework that explains what the pathways are, what activities fall within each pathway, and provides an indication of what type of support a signatory can get in terms of guidance and case studies and relevant education and initiatives to join and research by organisations in our now huge responsible investment community related to each of the pathways. And so that framework will be a great start for signatories to understand what's coming. In 2026, we aim to release foundational reporting, which will be this new and improved version of accountability for the 6 principles. And our aim, although it's a couple of years away yet, is that by 2027 we'll have this progression reporting, which can really support a more tailored and comparable set of information for a signatory, so they know how they're placed against their peers or investors like them. So we've got a 3-year plan, if you like. Now, if you don't mind me saying, Emily, the question everyone always asks straight after that is, so what's 2025 reporting, my reporting obligation going to be? And in 2025, signatories will have a mandatory obligation of completing our senior leadership statement. They'll know what that is, and an obligation to say what regulatory reporting obligations they also have. The reason we're doing that is so we can have a proper and thorough understanding of how the reporting burden globally that Kate described is affecting them, and how we can properly recognise what they're reporting to governments, because they don't really need to report twice unless they want some specific feedback from us. So that's the plan for the next 3 years, and we're heading straight back to the office after this interview to make sure it all happens.
And I would say it's not a one and done activity. After we've delivered the elements of progression pathways, I think we see it as progression, and we would see it as something that we keep releasing onto. And then once the pathways are there, as new attributes of what makes a responsible investor starts to emerge, we'll deliver information and content into those pathways. And so we can see it as almost like an ongoing development.
Fantastic, yes, so the progression pathways will keep progressing.
Exactly.
So let's go to questions from our audience. And if you can hear the bell in the background, that's just calling because we've got a live plenary session that will come up straight after this. So first question, asset managers use the PRI score with their clients. Will the progression pathways impact the score?
So it's an excellent question, and we're taking great care before we publish an answer to this, because we know that many asset managers have effectively a commercial need for some kind of scoring from the PRI or feedback. So we are working out what we can derive from foundational reporting, and signatories will appreciate. We're trying to make foundational reporting lighter, less burdensome, but of course the trade-off there is how differentiated can we be in our scoring, and so we're taking some care to get that right. The second thing is, progression reporting is likely to provide a framework that's going to help a much more sophisticated conversation in the market between clients and investment managers on what the objective of the investment manager's approach is and what they're trying to achieve and deliver. Now, I'm saying this because we think this provides a way in future to deal with the dialogue that managers and owners need to have on responsible investment practice. And I'm signaling that we think there might be a change to the way that scoring and that dialogue works in future. But it's too early for us to be precisely clear about how that will be designed. We're working through it. We're hearing feedback from signatories in the co-design process that Kate describes.
Fantastic. So signatories get their chance to input into that as well.
Indeed.
Brilliant. So what's our next question? Are we able to change pathways as things progress?
Yes. In fact, you're able to choose more than one pathway
Oh, great.
at any given point in time. So the purpose that we're looking at is we're not going to tell anybody what pathway to choose. They may have a large portion of their mandate that falls under pathway A, but they also may have a smaller part of their mandate or another portion of their mandate that falls under pathway B or even C. And so we're not going to be dictatorial about how people choose to report through progression pathways.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll add something to that. I think that we recognise that many investors want to articulate their overall organisational approach. For example, many managers in the US would like to be able to clearly say that they are there to fulfil their fiduciary responsibility on risk return and serve their client mandates. So in that situation, it helps a signatory to be able to say, my primary purpose is pathway A. That's my business model. But where a client asks me to address the drivers of sustainability factors, pathway B, or achieve some impact, then we'll set up a legal agreement where that's my investment job and I'll fulfill my duty by fulfilling that obligation. We need to find a way to support signatories to clearly distinguish when that's what they're doing. Because that's consistent with their overall purpose, but it doesn't mean the investor themselves is suddenly an impact investor as their primary reason for being. So there's a little bit of finessing we need to do on how the pathways work to make sure we cover off this issue for our signatories.
And do you have any ideas or a sense of which of the pathways will be the most popular?
Well, yes. Our rough estimate at the moment, or when we started this work, our assumption was that around 60% of our signatory AUM would fall into pathway A, around about 30% in pathway B, and around 10% in pathway C. Now, we have some evidence for that based on the reporting that signatories have given through our co-design process, but really we need to see how it works in practice. This is probably a good point to be able to say that progression happens within pathways. There's not an assumption that you go from A to B to C. It's not how it works. We recognise investors have different purposes. So will those numbers change significantly over time? It remains to be seen. But that's how we think it'll be at the start of this process.
Great stuff. So let's hear our next audience question, and thank you for submitting these live over Slido. What criteria or standards is the PRI using to determine whether a signatory in a particular pathway is more or less advanced compared to their peers, and how do you check that they're making progress?
Yeah, so this is a really important question, and we'd like to be clear that primarily we're trying to serve an educational purpose to support signatories' learning. I think the question is implying that there's a risk of signatories claiming that they might be advanced when maybe they're not, if I'm interpreting the question properly. And therefore you require standards, you require criteria so that everyone knows if somebody says, well, I'm advanced in pathway B, that there's been some evidence or checking for that. So once again, it's not our primary purpose to maintain accountability for signatories. However, we think that if signatories want to publicly claim that they're advanced in a pathway, then we've got some obligation to support transparency or some evidence, and that some of the steps or criteria in that pathway have actually been met. So there's some reporting and some transparency around that. So what I'm saying is that we shouldn't just assume that this is going to be a labelling scheme from the start, but we recognise that we have some sort of public good accountability role to make sure the pathways work for everyone. And so if signatories want to make claims, then we have to do some testing and verifying. This is another thing we're trying to fine-tune and make sure we get right before we release the pilot.
Kate, is there anything you want to add there about, if we're thinking positively, how can the participants in the pathways make progress and make sure they keep advancing?
So I think some of the things that we're starting to think about is how do we work through persona groups? How do we think about how to support our our signatories to compare themselves against averages across a signatory cohort, how to compare themselves and how to be able to see what's happening across other, what does good look like, what's best practice in a particular area. Pathway A will and B and C will cover a whole range of different principles. And so people might be very focused on one or two principles, and they might be able to see that their peers are focused in on other parts of the pathway. And we want to be able to demonstrate that the breadth and depth, and to be able to see that there are multitudes of areas where they can progress. And additionally, as we see the market evolving or regulatory norms evolving, we want to be able to keep the pathways moving north, so to speak, in a stepped environment, and to be able to keep everybody on board, because our job is not about keeping everybody accountable, as Nathan said. It's about helping and providing ways in which investors can become more responsible.
So you can support them in that progress.
Absolutely,
themselves.
yeah.
Fantastic. Nathan, we've got one final question we've got time for very briefly, and I know you've touched on this already, but the question is, how will the PRI ensure that progression pathways develop as a self-improvement mechanism and do not devolve into a manager selection screen?
Yeah, it's the right question. It's a very good question. So the first thing we'll do is limit the assessment process to foundational reporting. And that will be a very material way that we can influence this. And then when we provide the steps for the progression pathways, there will be educational and tools and training resources available. So hopefully people will see there are two very concrete steps that we can take in the right direction. The thing that we are not going to promise that we will stop is that asset owners ask asset managers, are you progressing? We expect that will happen. But once again, this is not an accountability to the PRI objective, so we will not be requiring a disclosure to us on this. But we will have frameworks, we could have due diligence questionnaires, we could have tools that the market could use. And there, I think the opportunity for our signatories collectively is if we can provide a good way to do this that reduces costs for everyone, reduces getting dozens of different due diligence questionnaires from different clients, then actually maybe there's a useful role for us. So we shouldn't assume that these types of questions about progression are going to be negative. They actually could be quite positive. It's just that PRI is not going to say you must do it to us.
Fantastic. What a great point to end on. Kate, Nathan, thank you so much for being here to talk about this really important, exciting initiative as it evolves itself as well. So thank you so much. We'll be going to the live plenary very shortly, and then we'll be back in the studio and we'll be talking to the winners of the PRI Outstanding Research Award. So we look forward to you joining us again then.